In chapter 22, we basically talk about Darwin and Darwin's large contribution to biology. As a matter of fact, his contribution, along with Wallace, changed the study of biology. Darwin was a very interesting man, and he eventually wrote on the origin of species, which he came up with this concept of descent with modification. And what you see here on this image, this is chapter 22 in your Campbell book. You see a couple of images of Darwin himself, and probably many of you are familiar with him as the older man with the beard, but he is recognizable. And what he did was he took a voyage on a small ship. This ship was about 65 feet long, so small. And his voyage, the ship was called the Beagle. His voyage took the path that you see on this image, the red arrows. This is how much he traveled. He actually traveled for about 4 years on that ship. And was the naturalist. He observed, it was his job to observe and bring back specimens to the British Isles. So we are going to talk about his trip, what he learned on his trip, and then throughout the course of his life, because he made this trip as a very young man, but throughout the course of his life, this information that he observed or drew from this ship on the Beagle, this voyage on the Beagle, served to be the theory that was supported the origin of species. So basically, it created the entire thought process throughout his entire life. Um, Darwin published on the origin of species in 1859. And of course, nothing is published in a vacuum, so there is much history that goes into the thought process. But what the origin of species focused on was the diversity of organisms, specifically that he saw in that 4 year of travel in all of those different areas. If you think back to the previous image, all of those countries and areas and places that he traveled to, he saw such diversity. And that he noted that there was, and this wasn't noted in the 4 years, but via researching his observations, he came to the conclusion that there are current species that are descendants from ancient species. And in the origin of species, he never used the word evolution, but that particular word has been associated with the information that's come out of the origin of species. So in popular and modern times, we definitely tend to associate the two, Charles Darwin with evolution. But evolution in his time or terminology can be defined as descent with modification. And so it was viewed as both a process and a pattern. So a process, a timeline that happens, and a pattern of natural selection, another term that we associate with Darwin. So this pattern of the individual in the species. Now understand, individuals don't evolve, populations evolve, but an individual in a species may have an adaptation that makes them a better fit for that particular environment. That means that throughout their lifetime, they're going to be able to have more offspring. Henceforth, those traits, and we have learned that they are inheritable, will be passed on, and so that individual or group of individuals with those traits will create a population with those traits. Again, individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. Just because I do want you to have a little bit of reference, instead of thinking that Darwin just worked in a vacuum. He did have many people that he studied and he revered, and many people that he built on with regard to his theories. So we will talk about several of them individually. This particular slide just gives you kind of a timeline of where we are between the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Civil War. You have this, and also with regard to Mendel, which we've already looked at, Darwin at the bottom of the screen. Darwin publishes his Origin of Species just before Mendel published his papers. And actually look at the difference between when Darwin traveled on the Beagle. That was 1831, and then he didn't publish until 1859. So he sat on this information, and not really sat on it, but stewed about it and thought about it for numerous years. And then you also see the timeline here, which remember with these teaching units, you can stop them and you can go back and come back again, and you can also have an image in front of you in terms of the timeline. I won't ask you the timeline at all, but I will ask you the concepts of some of these gentlemen that we will talk about, and they are all gentlemen here. I mean, they're males, I guess I might say. I don't know if they're gentlemen or not. I assume they're gentlemen, but anyway, this helps you put things a little bit in context. This is the image that comes straight from your textbook, which is also very good, but doesn't give you the global picture of what was happening. And it gives you the picture of what was happening around Darwin in terms of the different gentlemen, the different people that he had to pull his information from. The other thing you see here is at the top, this is a fossil that was uncovered dug up, and looking for fossils in the early 1800s was kind of the craze. It was the most popular thing, and some people were much better at it than others. But what they found was this huge fossil of something that looked like a huge rat, and they realized, and they were very happy about that, I guess, because they had quite a rat problem at that time, that those rats aren't around anymore. And so they have this idea that there are things that are related to what they see because of these fossils that are being dug up at that time. And then you also see a picture of Wallace, and he published something very, very similar to Darwin. As a matter of fact, there's a story where he wrote a small essay and shared it with Darwin, and then Darwin very, very quickly, he had already written his book, but he put the finishing touches on it, and then Wallace's essay caused Darwin to publish his book because he wanted to be first. It's a competition with regard to science, and most things it's a competition. But it wasn't necessarily to stick his finger in Wallace's eye. The two remained friends, and even in conversation, Darwin would say, with the help of Wallace. So we in modern times don't give Wallace enough credit, but at his time, I choose to think anyway that Darwin gave Wallace credit for coming up. And Wallace actually studied separate from Darwin. Wallace was away from Darwin and studying in a different area. He studied these frogs, whereas we associate him with finches, but Wallace came up with the same basic theories as Darwin at almost the same time. But it is Darwin who published the text, and so Darwin is the one who gets most of the historical credit. And Darwin did go to the Galapagos Islands. We certainly associate Darwin with the Galapagos Islands. And what you see down here is a sea iguana. And the iguana has the ability to swim. which most or no land iguanas do. And the iguana also has, this iguana also has these huge digits, which have the ability with what is with claws that have the ability to actually hold on to those rocks. So this iguana is not seen anywhere else, nor do these traits picked up anywhere else. And also there are several other animals on the Galapagos Islands that are somewhat like that. A little more of the history of the influences on Darwin. The Greek philosopher Aristotle came up with a system. I mean, people had been observing their natural world since the natural world was first. I mean, since we were first here, we were observing our natural world, obviously. But what Aristotle did was had this thought that populations, species, have existed on a ladder form with man at the top of the ladder, and you have this scale natura, and so a natural scale of you can think of it as a hierarchy where man is at the top, and I guess the things that they could see that were smaller at the bottom, so lower plants. At this time, remember, they couldn't see any bacteria, and that was the accepted arrangement in that time. Aristotle, of course, was a Greek philosopher. This would be in ancient times. And then you have Carolinus Linnaeus, or Carolinus, whichever you want to call him. He is the founder of taxonomy, which becomes a really important thing for you to have in your head, in the fact that he designed this system, this binomial system format for naming species. So and it's kind of easy to remember this because in his name is kind of a linear idea. And what you have is for each species you have like for example Homo sapiens. You have the distinguishing feature of that, and then the general genus that that particular species is in. And so we attribute that to Linus. The other thing another feature of the world that Darwin lived in was this emergence, I guess you might say, of the study of fossils, and much of this happened because people were getting out into the world, but this looking in sedimentary rock. And the finding fossils in sedimentary rock, and the I guess the desire to find fossils. So this almost this oh, I want to say it's kind of like today where you have this desire to be the first to post on Instagram or something like that. If you are, I don't know. I'm not saying everybody's like that, but there at this time there was such a rush to be the first to find this particular fossil or create this particular scientific discovery in terms of fossils. And so many people were looking for fossils, and they were finding them in riverbeds. And the idea behind this is sedimentary rocks will actually slowly put more and more sediment on top of the fossil. Then under time and pressure it'll actually turn into a rock and preserve that fossil over time. So this idea of fossil exploration became a science. It's called paleontology. Was largely developed by a French gentleman called Cuvier, so George Cuvier. And he also came up with his own theory, which is catastrophism, which we will need to pick that up on the next teaching time. We'll talk about George Cuvier on the next teaching time.